When security footage showed a man sleeping in his car outside Meridian Tech's headquarters for 3 consecutive nights, CEO Sarah Chen didn't hesitate to call the police. She'd built her company from nothing and wouldn't tolerate loitering near her billion-dollar empire. But when the officers handed her the manila envelope, the man had been clutching, containing a resume that would shatter everything she thought she knew about success, sacrifice, and second chances. Sarah realized, some stories can't be judged from behind tinted glass windows 30 floors up. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 32nd floor, each droplet catching the amber glow of Seattle's evening lights before sliding into oblivion. Sarah Chen stood with her back to her mahogany desk, arms crossed, watching the security monitor with the same intensity she reserved for quarterly earnings reports. Third night, Marcus, her head of security, said behind her. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. Same car, same spot. Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the rain, streaked glass-sharp cheekbones, black hair pulled into a precise bun, the kind of controlled composure that had built Meridian Tech from a garage startup into a billion-dollar empire. At 38, she'd learned to read people like profit margins, quickly, accurately, and without sentiment. License plate? Registered to a David Martinez. Clean record. No warrants. On the monitor, the figure in the beat-up Honda Civic shifted slightly. Even through the grainy footage, Sarah could make out the man's silhouetted, broad-shouldered, hunched over something in his lap. A book. Or papers. He's not homeless, she said, more to herself than to Marcus. Look at his posture, the way he holds himself. Ma'am? Call the police. Marcus hesitated. In the 5 years he'd worked for Sarah Chen, he'd learned to recognize the different shades of her decisiveness. This wasn't the cold calculation she used to fire underperforming executives. This was something else. Something that made him uncomfortable. Ma'am, he's not really. He's loitering on private property. Sarah's voice cut through the ambient hum of the office like a blade. I didn't build this company by ignoring problems that camp outside my front door. The call took 12 minutes. Sarah watched from her window as 2 patrol cars pulled into the parking garage, their red and blue lights painting abstract patterns on the concrete walls. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the body language, the man's hands raised, calm and non-threatening, the officer's relaxed stance as they realized this wasn't the situation they'd expected. One of the officers was walking back toward the building now, carrying something. A manila envelope. Chen? Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Officer Rodriguez is here to see you. Sarah smoothed her blazer and returned to her desk. The Seattle skyline, now a backdrop to her authority rather than a window to her curiosity. Officer Rodriguez was younger than she'd expected, with kind eyes that suggested he'd joined the force to help people rather than control them. He held the manila envelope like it contained something fragile. Ms. Chen, I wanted to thank you for calling this in. He set the envelope on her desk with careful deliberation. But I think there might be some context you'd want to know about. Sarah didn't touch the envelope. Is he gone? Yes, ma'am. But he asked me to give you this. Said he'd been hoping to get it to you directly, but... Rodriguez gestured vaguely toward the 32 floors between Sarah's office and the parking garage. Well, he understands why that wasn't possible. What is it? A resume, ma'am. Job application for your software engineering position. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. He was sleeping in his car for 3 nights to deliver a resume? His daughter's in the hospital, Rodriguez said quietly. Seattle Children's. Has been for the past week. He's been staying close so he can be there when she wakes up from her surgeries. But he can't afford a hotel. Saw your job posting. Thought maybe. He trailed off, reading the calculation in Sarah's face. Anyway, he wanted you to have it. After Rodriguez left, Sarah stared at the envelope for a long time. The office was quiet now, except for the rain and the distant hum of traffic 32 floors below. Her assistant had gone home hours ago. The cleaning crew wouldn't arrive until midnight. It was just Sarah and the manila envelope and the weight of a decision she hadn't expected to make. She opened it. The resume was printed on standard copy paper, slightly wrinkled from being carried in a car for 3 days. David Martinez, 34, software engineer. The formatting was clean, professional, the kind of attention to detail that spoke to competence. But it was the cover letter that stopped her cold. Dear Ms. Chen, I know this isn't the conventional way to apply for a position at Meridian Tech. If I could have made an appointment, I would have. If I could have submitted this through your online portal from a comfortable office somewhere, I would have done that too. But my 8-year-old daughter Emma is in room 412 at Seattle Children's Hospital, recovering from her second heart surgery in 6 months. The doctors say she's going to be fine. But she's been asking me every day if I found a job yet because she knows we lost our house last month and she's worried about where we'll live when she gets out. I've been sleeping in my car in your parking garage because it's the closest safe place to the hospital and because I wanted to learn everything I could about Meridian Tech before I applied. I've watched your employees come and go for 3 days. I've read every press release, every article, every blog post about your company culture. You built something extraordinary from nothing. I know because I've tried to build things too, though mine were smaller, much smaller. Before Emma got sick, I was working as a freelance developer, building custom software for small businesses. It wasn't much, but it was enough. We had a little house in Tacoma, nothing fancy, but Emma had her own room in a backyard where she could practice her violin. That was before the medical bills. I'm not writing to ask for charity. I'm writing because I believe I can contribute something valuable to Meridian Tech. I've been coding since I was 12. I've built applications that serve thousands of users. I've solved problems that other developers said were unsolvable, but more than that, I understand what it means to build something from nothing. I understand what it means to fight for something that matters more than yourself. Emma is going to be okay. The doctors are confident about that. But she needs to know that her dad is the kind of man who doesn't give up. She needs to know that when life knocks you down, you find a way to stand back up. I've attached my portfolio and references. I know my situation is unconventional. I know there are probably dozens of qualified candidates who applied through proper channels, who have stable addresses and don't sleep in parking garages. But I also know that the woman who built Meridian Tech from a garage startup understands that sometimes the best people come from the most unexpected places. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, David Martinez. Sarah read the letter twice. Then she read it again. The rain had stopped while she was reading, and the silence in her office felt different now. Heavier, more complete. She walked back to the window and looked down at the parking garage. The Honda Civic was gone, but she could still see the space where it had been parked. Could still imagine the man inside, hunched over his laptop, or his resume, or maybe just watching the building where he hoped his future might be decided. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant. Reminder: 8 a.m. interview tomorrow with Stanford MBA for senior developer position. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She picked up her office phone and dialed HR. Janet? It's Sarah. I know it's late, but I need you to do something for me first thing tomorrow morning. She paused, looking at the resume spread across her desk. I need you to call David Martinez. Set up an interview. Tomorrow, if possible. Is this about the senior developer position? Sarah hesitated. The senior developer position paid $180,000 a year plus equity. It required 7 years of experience and a portfolio of enterprise-level applications. On paper, David Martinez was qualified, more than qualified, but this wasn't about qualifications. Yes, she said finally. It's about the senior developer position. After she hung up, Sarah gathered the resume and cover letter and slipped them back into the manila envelope. But instead of filing it away, she carried it with her to the elevator. The parking garage was empty except for her Tesla and the overnight security guard's sedan. Sarah walked to the space where the Honda Civic had been parked and stood there for a moment, trying to imagine what it would feel like to call this home for 3 nights. The concrete was cold beneath her designer heels. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh, institutional white. She thought about Emma Martinez in room 412 at Seattle Children's Hospital, asking her father every day if he'd found a job yet. She thought about herself at 8 years old, watching her own father work 3 jobs to keep their family afloat after they'd lost everything in the recession of '91. She remembered the apartment with thin walls and thinner bank accounts, remembered her father's calloused hands and the way he'd fall asleep at the kitchen table with his head on his laptop, still trying to build something better for his daughter. She'd forgotten about that father. Somewhere along the way, between the IPO and the Forbes covers and the corner office with the view of Elliott Bay, she'd forgotten about the man who'd taught her that success wasn't about where you started it, was about refusing to quit when everything fell apart. Sarah Chen stood in her empty parking garage, holding a stranger's resume, and for the first time in years, she remembered what it felt like to be hungry. Not for food, for hope. David Martinez sat in the hospital cafeteria at 6:47 a.m., nursing his 3rd cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the windows gold. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, but sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when Emma might wake up. Not when his phone might ring. The coffee was terrible, but it was warm, and it was 50 cents, and it kept his hands busy while he waited. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Seattle area code. Hello? Mr. Martinez? This is Janet Walsh from Meridian Tech's Human Resources Department. I'm calling about your application for our senior software engineer position. David's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Around him, the cafeteria continued its morning rhythm, nurses grabbing breakfast between shifts, doctors checking phones between rounds, families like his learning to live in the spaces between hope and fear. Yes. Thank you for calling. Miss Chen would like to meet with you today if possible. Are you available at 10 this morning? David looked toward the elevators that led to the children's ward. Emma was stable. The nurses had promised to call if anything changed. But leaving felt like stepping away from everything that mattered. Mr. Martinez? Yes, I'm here. 10 o'clock would be. Yes, thank you. Excellent. Do you have our address? David almost laughed. Yes, ma'am. I know where you are. After he hung up, he sat in the cafeteria for another 20 minutes, staring at his reflection in the black screen of his phone. When was the last time he'd worn anything other than the same 3 t-shirts and jeans he'd been rotating for weeks? When was the last time he'd looked at himself and seen someone worth hiring instead of someone barely hanging on? The men's room on the 4th floor had better lighting than the one in the lobby. David splashed cold water on his face and tried to see past the exhaustion in his eyes. He'd packed one good shirt and a tie in the car, optimistic planning from a week ago when he'd still believed in backup plans. The shirt was wrinkled but clean. The tie was the same one he'd worn to Emma's first surgery, navy blue with thin silver stripes. His lucky tie, she'd called it. Though luck seemed like a complicated concept in a place where 8-year-olds needed heart surgery. Room 412 was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and Emma's soft breathing. She looked smaller than her 8 years, dwarfed by the hospital bed and the machinery that surrounded her like electronic guardians. But her color was good, better than it had been in months. David sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. It was warm, which felt like a miracle every time. "Hey kiddo," he whispered. "Dad's got to go somewhere for a little while, but I'll be back before you wake up, okay? And maybe I'll have some good news." Emma's fingers twitched slightly in his, and for a moment David thought she might open her eyes. But she remained still, breathing steadily, trusting him to make the right choices while she fought her own battles. He kissed her forehead and left before he could change his mind. The Meridian Tech building looked different in daylight, taller, more imposing. David had spent 3 nights looking up at its glass facade, but now he was going to walk through the front doors like he belonged there. The lobby was everything he'd expected: polished marble, soaring ceilings, the kind of casual wealth that announced itself through understatement. The security desk was staffed by a different guard than the one who'd watched the police escort him away 12 hours earlier. David Martinez, he told the receptionist, a young woman with purple hair and the kind of genuine smile that suggested Meridian Tech actually cared about culture fit. I have a 10 o'clock with Miss Chen. Perfect. Let me call up. She spoke into her headset with the easy efficiency of someone who made visitors feel welcome for a living. Janet will be right down to get you. David sat in one of the lobby's leather chairs and tried not to calculate how much it had cost. Everything in the space spoke to success so complete it had become invisible to the people who worked there. The coffee in the reception area was from a machine that probably cost more than his car. The magazines on the tables were current. Mr. Martinez? Janet Walsh was exactly what David had expected from her voice professional, kind, the sort of HR director who'd learned to see potential in people rather than just credentials. She was maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and the confident handshake of someone who'd spent decades making difficult conversations feel manageable. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice," she said as they walked toward the elevators. "I have to say, your application certainly made an impression." The elevator was silent, except for the soft hum of machinery and David's heartbeat. He watched the floor numbers climb 15, 20, 25, and tried to remember the last time he'd been this high above the ground. The last time he'd had reason to be. "Miss Chen's office is on 32, Janet said, as if reading his thoughts. "She likes to say she works in the clouds so she can see the bigger picture." The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that was all clean lines and natural light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Seattle that made the city look like a carefully arranged model. David could see Elliott Bay in the distance, ferries moving like toys across water that glittered in the morning sun. "She'll see you now," Janet said, gesturing toward a pair of mahogany doors. Sarah Chen's office was smaller than David had expected but more impressive, not because of its size, but because of its restraint. The furniture was expensive but not ostentatious. The art on the walls was original but not overwhelming. Everything in the space suggested power that didn't need to announce itself. Sarah Chen stood behind her desk, studying a tablet. She was smaller than he'd imagined, but there was something in her posture that filled the room, the kind of presence that came from making decisions that affected thousands of people. "Mr. Martinez." She looked up, and David was surprised by her eyes. He'd expected coldness, the calculating gaze of someone who'd built an empire. Instead, he saw intelligence, yes, but also something that looked almost like curiosity. "Please, sit." David sat in the chair across from her desk and tried not to notice that his resume was spread across the mahogany surface between them. His words, his history, his desperation laid out for examination. "I read your cover letter," Sarah said, settling into her own chair. "Tell me about Emma." It wasn't the question David had expected. He'd prepared for technical discussions, coding challenges, questions about his experience with enterprise-level systems. He hadn't prepared to talk about his daughter. She's 8, he said carefully. "She was born with a congenital heart defect. We've known since she was a baby that she'd need surgery eventually, but last year it became urgent." "What kind of defect?" "Ventricular septal defect, a hole in the wall between the chambers of her heart. It's been getting larger, making her heart work harder." David realized he was explaining this the same way the doctors had explained it to him, using clinical terms to make an impossible situation sound manageable. "She's had 2 surgeries in the past 6 months. This last one was to repair some complications from the first." Sarah nodded, and David caught something in her expression that surprised him. Not pity, which he'd learned to recognize and resent. Something else. Understanding, maybe. "And you've been sleeping in your car?" "Yes, ma'am. For 3 nights, yes." "Why didn't you just submit your application online like everyone else?" David had practiced this answer, but sitting across from Sarah Chen, watching her study him with the same intensity she probably brought to board meetings and acquisition deals, the practiced words felt inadequate. "Because I needed this job," he said finally. Not wanted, needed. And I've learned that when you need something, you don't trust it to algorithms and automated systems. You show up. You make yourself impossible to ignore. Even if it means getting arrested? I wasn't arrested. But you could have been. David met her gaze. Yes, I could have been. Sarah leaned back in her chair, and for a moment the office was quiet except for the distant hum of the city below. David could see her thinking, weighing something he couldn't quite identify. Walk me through your experience with React, she said suddenly. For the next 40 minutes, they talked code. Not the broad strokes of software development, but the specific show David had built a customer management system for a chain of auto repair shops, the elegant solution he'd found for a data visualization problem that had stumped a team of consultants, the mobile app he'd developed for a food truck association that had increased their collective revenue by 30%. David found himself relaxing despite the circumstances. This was familiar territory, the language of logic and problem-solving that had sustained him since he was 12 years old and discovered that computers made sense in ways that people sometimes didn't. Show me, Sarah said, sliding her laptop across the desk. David looked at the screen a coding challenge that would have taken most developers 20 or 30 minutes to solve. He solved it in 7, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the fluid confidence of someone who thought in algorithms. Sarah watched him work, and David became aware that she wasn't just evaluating his technical skills. She was studying his process, the way he approached problems, the quiet focus that had made him good at this work, even when everything else in his life was falling apart. Impressive, she said when he finished. Janet tells me you're interested in our senior developer position. Yes, ma'am. It pays $180,000 a year plus equity, full health insurance. 4 weeks paid vacation. Sarah paused, watching David's reaction. It's a significant responsibility. You'd be leading a team of 12 developers working on our core platform. David tried to keep his expression neutral, but $180,000 might as well have been $1 million. It was more money than he'd ever imagined making. More than enough to pay Emma's medical bills and find them a real home, and maybe even start saving for her college fund. I understand, he said. Do you? Because I need to be clear about something, Mr. Martinez. I'm not offering you this job because I feel sorry for you. I'm not offering it because you slept in my parking garage or because your daughter is sick. I'm offering it because in 40 minutes, you've demonstrated that you're exactly the kind of developer Meridian Tech needs. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city spread below them. But I also need you to understand that this job will demand everything you have. 60-hour weeks sometimes. Complex problems that don't have obvious solutions. The kind of pressure that breaks people who aren't ready for it. David thought about Emma, lying in her hospital bed, trusting him to build something better for both of them. I'm ready, he said. Sarah turned back to him, and David saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite read. Approval, maybe. Or recognition. One more question, she said. Why software? Why this career? It was the kind of question that could have dozens of answers, but sitting in Sarah Chen's office, looking at the woman who'd built an empire from nothing, David found himself telling the truth. Because code doesn't lie, he said. It either works or it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, there's always a reason. Always a solution. Everything else in life. He gestured vaguely, thinking about hospital bills and insurance companies and the arbitrary cruelty of 8-year-olds needing heart surgery. Everything else is chaos, but code makes sense. Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile David had seen from her. Welcome to Meridian Tech, Mr. Martinez. 6 weeks later, David Martinez stood in the doorway of his new apartment, holding Emma's hand as she took her first steps across the threshold. The afternoon light streamed through windows that actually opened, illuminating hardwood floors and walls that belonged to them for the next year, maybe longer if things kept going well. It's so big, Dad, Emma whispered, her voice still carrying the hoarseness that lingered after weeks of intubation. But she was walking. She was breathing without assistance. She was home. Not too big, David said, squeezing her hand, just big enough. The apartment wasn't much by Seattle. Standard stew bedrooms in a converted Victorian in the Fremont neighborhood, with a view of the canal if you stood on your tiptoes and looked through the kitchen window just right. But it had Emma's own room and a living room where she could practice violin and a kitchen table where David could spread out his work without covering every available surface. It felt like a palace. Emma wandered through the space with the careful deliberation of someone relearning how to inhabit the world. The doctors had cleared her for normal activities, but normal was still a negotiation between what her heart could handle and what her 8-year-old spirit demanded. "Can I see my room again?" she asked. They'd looked at it twice already, but David understood. After months of hospital rooms and sleeping in cars, and the kind of uncertainty that made children old before their time, claiming space felt like an act of faith. Emma's room faced east, which meant morning light and a view of the neighbor's garden. David had spent his first paycheck on furniture, not much, but enough. A bed with a white wooden frame. A dresser with drawers that actually closed properly. A small desk where she could do homework and draw pictures and write the stories that had sustained her through the long hospital nights. "I want to put my violin here," Emma said, pointing to a corner near the window, "so the music can go outside." David nodded, though his throat felt tight. The violin had been a casualty of their financial collapse, sold along with most of their belongings to pay for Emma's first surgery. But maybe now. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah Chen. "Team meeting tomorrow at 9. Your input on the Morrison project would be valuable." 6 weeks at Meridian Tech had been a revelation in ways David hadn't expected. The work was challenging, demanding, exactly what Sarah had promised, but it was also collaborative in a way that his freelance career had never been. He was part of something larger than himself, building software that served millions of users, solving problems that mattered. And Sarah Chen continued to surprise him. She wasn't the cold executive he'd imagined from 32 floors below. She was demanding, yes, and precise in ways that could be intimidating. But she was also invested in her people's success with an intensity that felt personal. She knew the names of her developers' children. She remembered birthdays. She'd somehow arranged for David's health insurance to kick in immediately, waiving the usual 90-day waiting period without fanfare or explanation. "Dad?" Emma was standing by her window, looking out at the garden. "Can we plant flowers?" "I don't think the landlord would." "Not in the ground, in pots. Like the lady next door." Emma pointed to the neighboring yard, where a woman in her 70s was tending to an elaborate container garden. "She has roses and tomatoes and herbs and everything." David looked at his daughter, really looked at her. Her color was good, better than it had been in months. The faint blue tinge that had haunted her lips and fingernails was gone, replaced by the pink flush of a healthy child. But more than that, she was planning again, thinking about the future, wanting to grow things. "Yeah," he said, "we can plant flowers." The next morning, David arrived at Meridian Tech to find his team already gathered in Conference Room B, laptops open, coffee steaming, the kind of focused energy that preceded complex problem-solving. He'd been leading the Morrison project for 3 weeks, now a custom analytics platform for a major healthcare network, and it was the kind of challenge that made him grateful for every skill he'd developed during his freelance years. "David?" "Good," Sarah said as he took his seat at the conference table. "I was just telling the team about the client feedback from yesterday's demo. Morrison Health Services was one of Meridian Tech's largest clients, a network of hospitals and clinics that served the Pacific Northwest. Their existing data systems were fragmented, inefficient, the kind of technological legacy that made simple tasks unnecessarily complex. David's team was building them something better, unified, intuitive, designed around the actual workflow of healthcare professionals rather than the abstract preferences of IT departments. They loved the real-time dashboard," Sarah continued, "but they want to expand the scope. Integration with their patient scheduling system, automated reporting for regulatory compliance, maybe even predictive analytics for resource allocation." David nodded, his mind already working through the technical implications. That's a significant expansion. We'd need to redesign the database architecture, probably implement a microservices approach for the scheduling integration. How long? Sarah asked. Done right? 4 months, maybe 5. They want it in 6 weeks. The room fell silent. David looked around the table at his Team 12, developers who'd learned to trust his judgment over the past month and a half. They were good people, talented programmers who could work miracles when properly motivated, but miracles had limits. Ms. Chen, said Jennifer, one of the senior developers, that timeline is impossible. David finished quietly. I mean, we could deliver something in 6 weeks, but it wouldn't be what they need. It would be a compromise solution that would cause more problems than it solved. Sarah leaned back in her chair, and David recognized the expression on her face. It was the same calculating look she'd worn during his interview, the same assessment of character that had somehow led to his hiring. What would you recommend? She asked. David thought about Morrison Health Services, about the nurses and doctors and administrators who would use whatever his team built. He thought about the patient data that would flow through their system, the lives that depended on accurate information being available at the right moment. He thought about Emma, lying in her hospital bed, trusting the medical professionals around her to make the right decisions with incomplete information and inadequate tools. I'd recommend we tell them the truth, David said. That good software takes time. That rushing complex systems leads to security vulnerabilities and data integrity problems and the kind of failures that can hurt people. That they hired Meridian Tech because we build solutions that work, not because we make impossible promises. The conference room was quiet for a long moment. David could feel his team watching him, wondering if he'd just talked himself out of a job. Sarah Chen had a reputation for demanding results, and clients like Morrison Health Services weren't known for their patience. But Sarah was smiling. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, she said. Jennifer, can you set up a call with Morrison's CTO for this afternoon? I want David to walk him through the technical requirements personally. The meeting ended with assignments and deadlines and the controlled chaos of a team mobilizing around a complex challenge. But as the developers filed out, Sarah caught David's arm. Walk with me, she said. They took the elevator to the 32nd floor, emerging into Sarah's reception area. But instead of going to her office, Sarah led David to a conference room he'd never seen before, smaller than the others, with a round table and walls covered in whiteboards filled with diagrams and equations and the visual debris of strategic thinking. This is where I do my real work, Sarah said, settling into one of the chairs around the table. The office is for show, this is for thinking. David sat across from her, wondering why he'd been brought here. Through the window, he could see the Seattle skyline, the same view he'd admired from Sarah's office but somehow more intimate from this smaller space. How's Emma? Sarah asked. She's good, really good. We moved into our new apartment yesterday, and she's... David paused, searching for the right words. She's planning things again, talking about the future. It's the first time in months that she's seemed like a kid instead of a patient. Sarah nodded. And you? How are you adjusting? It was a simple question, but David sensed layers beneath it. How was he adjusting to having a steady paycheck? To working on a team again? To sleeping in an actual bed instead of his car? It's been an adjustment, he said honestly. Good, but different. I've been freelancing for so long that having colleagues again, having people depend on my decisions, it's taken some getting used to. But you're good at it. Leading the team, I mean. I think so. I hope so. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that David hadn't heard before. I built this company because I believed technology could solve problems that mattered, she said. Not just make processes more efficient or help people buy things they don't need, but actually improve lives in measurable ways. Healthcare, education, environmental sustainability, the big challenges that require both technical sophistication and genuine empathy. David listened, sensing that Sarah was working towards something important. But success changes things, she continued. The bigger we got, the more our clients started asking us to cut corners, deliver faster, cheaper, with fewer safeguards. And I found myself saying yes to things I should have said no to, because the revenue was significant and the market was competitive, and it seemed like smart business. She turned back to David, and he saw something in her expression that surprised him. Uncertainty, maybe. Or regret. What you said in there, about telling Morrison the truth, that's what I used to do. Before we went public, before I had shareholders and board meetings and quarterly earnings targets, I used to tell clients that good work takes time, that shortcuts have consequences, that our job was to build things that last. What changed? David asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I forgot why I started this company. I got so focused on growing it that I lost track of what growth was supposed to serve. She stood and walked to one of the whiteboards, studying a diagram that looked like a network architecture. But watching you with your team these past few weeks, seeing how you approach problems, it's reminded me of something, of who I used to be before I learned to compromise. David felt the weight of the moment, the sense that this conversation mattered in ways he couldn't fully understand yet. Emma's heart surgery, Sarah said suddenly. The medical software the doctors used to plan the procedure, to monitor her vital signs during the operation that was built by companies like ours, people like us. And if we cut corners, if we prioritize speed over accuracy or profit over safety, she didn't finish the sentence, but David understood. The software that had helped save his daughter's life was only as good as the people who built it. The decisions they made, the standards they upheld, the care they brought to their work, it all mattered in ways that extended far beyond code repositories and user interfaces. I want you to take over as Director of Engineering, Sarah said. David blinked. I'm sorry, what? Jennifer's been asking for a promotion to management for the past year, but she's not ready. Too focused on technical perfection, not enough attention to the human elements of leadership, but you. You understand that technology is only as good as the people it serves. Director of Engineering. David tried to process what that would mean. More responsibility, certainly, but also more influence over the kind of work Meridian Tech produced. More ability to ensure that shortcuts weren't taken, that the software they built was worthy of the trust people placed in it. The salary would be $240,000, Sarah added, plus a significant equity package, and you'd report directly to me. David thought about Emma, practicing violin in their new apartment, about the garden they were going to plant together, about the future that was finally starting to feel possible again. When would you need an answer? He asked. Take your time, Sarah said. But David, whatever you decide, I want you to know that hiring you was one of the smartest decisions I've made in years. You reminded me why I got into this business in the first place. David walked back to his desk in a kind of daze, Sarah's offer echoing in his mind. Around him, the office hummed with its usual activity, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the quiet intensity of people solving complex problems. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility. His phone buzzed. A text from Emma. Dad, can we go look at violins this weekend? The music store has rentals. David smiled, typing back, Yes. We can do that. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future felt like something he could build, instead of something he had to survive. 3 months into David's tenure as Director of Engineering, the crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning disguised as a routine client call. Morrison Health Services CTO, Dr. Howd on our comm. Patricia Vance appeared on the conference room screen with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested someone's day was about to get significantly worse. Behind her, David could see the familiar chaos of a hospital IT department under pressure, multiple monitors, concerned faces, the electronic symphony of a system struggling to function. We have a problem, Dr. Vance said without preamble. The integration with our legacy patient record system is causing data corruption. Nothing catastrophic yet, but our overnight audit found 12 instances where patient medication histories were displaying incorrectly. David felt the familiar chill that came with real-world consequences. Medication histories weren't abstract data points. They were the difference between proper care and potentially fatal interactions. In the wrong hands, corrupted medical data could kill people. "How long ago did this start?" he asked, already pulling up the system architecture on his laptop. "We're not sure. The automated checks only flagged it last night, but the corruption could have been happening for days without detection." Sarah, who had joined the call from her office, leaned forward. "What's your immediate plan?" "We've rolled back to the previous system version, but that means we've lost integration capabilities. We're essentially back to manual data entry for anything that crosses between systems." Dr. Vance's frustration was evident even through the video connection. "Our staff is overwhelmed, our workflow is compromised, and our board is asking hard questions about why we spent $2 million on software that's making things worse instead of better." After the call ended, David found himself alone in the conference room with Sarah and the weight of a problem that had no easy solutions. The Morrison integration had been running smoothly for 6 weeks. The corruption issue was subtle, the kind of edge case that might emerge only under specific conditions with certain data sets. "Options?" Sarah asked. David had been thinking through possibilities since Dr. Vance first mentioned the corruption. "We could patch the existing integration, but that's addressing symptoms rather than root causes. Better would be to rebuild the data bridge from scratch, implement stronger validation protocols, add redundant integrity checks." Timeline? 3 weeks minimum. Maybe 4 if we want to do comprehensive testing. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying the architectural diagrams David had sketched on the whiteboard. "And in the meantime?" "Morrison operates with manual workarounds and accepts the inefficiency. Or—" David hesitated, knowing his next words would complicate everything. "Or we recommend they temporarily switch to a competitor's solution." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a lit fuse. Morrison Health Services represented nearly 12% of Meridian Tech's annual revenue. Recommending a competitor's product, even temporarily, could cost the company millions, but it was the right thing to do. "That's not a business decision," Sarah said carefully. "That's an ethical one." David met her gaze. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the conference room, and David found himself thinking about Emma, who would be getting out of school in an hour, probably wondering what they'd have for dinner and whether he'd remembered to buy more rosin for her violin bow. Normal problems. The kind of father-daughter negotiations that felt impossibly precious after months of more urgent concerns. "There's something I haven't told you about Morrison," Sarah said finally. "They're not just a client. They're where my mother was treated for pancreatic cancer 2 years ago." David felt the conversation shift, becoming something more personal than a business discussion. "She spent 6 weeks in their oncology ward. I watched the nurses struggle with systems that didn't talk to each other, saw doctors waste precious time waiting for test results that should have been instantly available. It was part of why I was so committed to making this project work not just technically, but meaningfully." Sarah turned back to David, and he saw something in her expression that he'd glimpsed before but never fully understood. Vulnerability, maybe? The weight of personal stakes disguised as professional decisions. "My mother died 3 weeks before we signed the Morrison contract," she continued. "I told myself it was about building better healthcare technology, but really, I think I was trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. Make sure other families didn't have to watch their loved ones suffer because of inefficient systems." David thought about Emma's heart surgery, about the seamless coordination between surgical teams and monitoring systems that had made the difference between success and catastrophe. About the software engineers, somewhere who had built those tools with the kind of care that translated into saved lives. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried a resolve that David recognized from his first day at Meridian Tech. "I want to call Dr. Vance and tell her we're recommending MedSync's integration platform for temporary use. while we rebuild our solution properly. I want to authorize a full engineering review of our development process to identify how we missed this issue, and I want to establish new protocols that prioritize data integrity over delivery timelines." David nodded. "That's going to be an expensive decision. Less expensive than the alternative." The call to Dr. Vance was difficult, but not as challenging as David had expected. Her relief at having a clear path forward outweighed her frustration with the situation. Morrison Health Services would implement MedSync's solution immediately while Meridian Tech worked on a long-term fix. The financial impact would be significant, but the relationship would survive. More importantly, patient safety would be protected. David spent the rest of the afternoon in his office, restructuring the Morrison project timeline and drafting new development protocols. The work was complex, requiring him to balance technical requirements with resource constraints and client expectations. But it felt right in a way that purely profit-driven decisions never had. His phone rang at 6:30, just as he was preparing to leave for the day. "David? It's Dr. Chen from Seattle Children's. I hope you don't mind me calling directly." David's blood went cold. Dr. Chen was Emma's cardiologist, the surgeon who had performed both of her heart operations. He only called when something was wrong. "Is Emma okay?" "She's fine," Dr. Chen said quickly. "More than fine, actually. That's why I'm calling. Her latest echocardiogram shows complete healing of the septal defect. No residual leakage, excellent function across all chambers. From a cardiac perspective, she's essentially a normal 8-year-old now." David sank into his chair, relief flooding through him like a physical force. She's completely healed?" "Completely. She'll need annual checkups for the next few years, but there's no reason to expect any future complications. She can participate in normal activities, sports, whatever her interests lead her toward." After Dr. Chen hung up, David sat in his office for a long time, watching the Seattle skyline transition from afternoon light to evening shadows. Emma was healthy, really truly healthy for the first time in her life. The future that had seemed so fragile just months ago was now solidly theirs to build. His phone buzzed, a text from Emma. "Dad, where are you?" "I made pasta, and it's getting cold." David smiled, gathering his things. His daughter was home, cooking dinner, worried about pasta getting cold. The most beautifully ordinary problems in the world. The drive home took him through Fremont, past the music store where they'd rented Emma's violin, past the garden center where they'd bought seeds for their container garden. Normal life, purchased with the kind of steady paycheck that most people took for granted, but that felt like a daily miracle to David. Emma was waiting at the kitchen table when he arrived, violin case open beside her plate, sheet music spread across the surface like placemats. She'd been practicing Bach, the same piece she'd been working on before her surgery, but with a confidence that came from having breath to sustain the longer phrases. "Dr. Chen called," David said as he sat down across from her. Emma looked up from her pasta, and David saw something in her expression that he'd been waiting months to see. Not worry. Not the careful hopefulness of someone managing expectations, just curiosity. "What did he say?" "He said, 'You're completely healed. Your heart is perfect.'" Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the information with the serious consideration she brought to everything important. Then she smiled, not the brave smile she'd worn through months of uncertainty, but the unreserved joy of a child who could finally stop being careful. "Does that mean I can play soccer?" she asked. "If you want to." "And swim at the community center?" "Yes." "And eat ice cream without you counting my sodium intake?" David laughed. "Within reason." Emma stood up and hugged him then, with the fierce intensity of someone who had learned not to take physical affection for granted. David held her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her perfectly functioning heart against his chest. "Dad?" she said after a moment. "Yeah?" "Thank you for not giving up." David's throat felt tight. "Thank you for not giving up either." Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, David found himself back at his laptop, not working on code but writing. An email to Sarah, explaining the phone call from Dr. Chen, thanking her for the opportunity that had made everything possible. But the words felt inadequate, too small to contain the magnitude of what had happened. Instead, he closed the laptop and walked to Emma's room. She was asleep, breathing easily, her violin on the nightstand beside her bed. Through her window, he could see their container garden on the fire escape tomatoes and herbs and the flowers Emma had insisted on planting even though they served no practical purpose. Beauty for its own sake. The luxury of thinking beyond mere survival. David watched his daughter sleep and thought about the choices that had led them here. The night he'd decided to park outside Meridian Tech instead of giving up. Sarah's decision to see past his circumstances to his potential. The morning he'd chosen honesty over expedience in Sarah's conference room, small decisions that had accumulated into a transformed life. Emma stirred slightly, and David realized she was awake. "Dad? Sorry, kiddo. Didn't mean to wake you." "It's okay." She sat up in bed, looking out at their garden. "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud of us?" David's breath caught. Emma rarely mentioned her mother, who had died in a car accident when Emma was 3. Too young for clear memories but old enough to carry the absence like a shadow. "I think she'd be amazed by how strong and brave you've been," David said. "I think she'd be proud of both of us." Emma nodded, settling back into her pillows. "I think she'd like our apartment, and my violin playing, and the way you make pancakes on Sunday mornings." "I think you're right." "Dad? Yeah? I love you." "I love you too, Emma, so much." David stayed in her doorway until her breathing evened out again, watching over the most important thing in his world. Tomorrow he would return to Meridian Tech, would continue building software that mattered, would help Sarah create something worthy of the trust people placed in their technology. But tonight, he was simply a father whose daughter was healthy and safe and dreaming of a future full of possibilities they'd almost lost. 1 year later, David Martinez stood in the same parking garage where Officer Rodriguez had found him sleeping in his car, but now he wore a tailored suit and carried the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly where he belonged. The Meridian Tech employee parking garage had assigned spaces now, and his nameplate read, "David Martinez, VP of Engineering," a promotion that had surprised him less than Sarah's reasoning for it. "You understand that technology serves people, not the other way around," she'd said 6 months ago. "That's rarer than you might think, especially at our level." Tonight was different, though. Tonight was the annual Employee Appreciation Dinner, held in the building's renovated lobby, and for the first time since joining Meridian Tech, David had brought Emma as his guest. She stood beside him now, wearing a navy blue dress and the violin pin he'd bought her for Christmas, looking around the transformed space with the careful attention she brought to new environments. The lobby had been converted into an elegant dining room, complete with round tables, string quartet, and the kind of understated luxury that characterized everything Sarah Chen touched. "Is that her?" Emma whispered, nodding toward the registration table where Sarah was greeting employees and their families. "That's her. She's smaller than I thought." David smiled. "That's what I thought too, the first time I met her." Emma had been asking about Sarah Chen for months, the woman who had given David the job that changed their lives, who had somehow arranged for Emma's medical bills to be covered through the company's executive health plan, who had sent flowers to the hospital and a handwritten note after Emma's final surgery. "Can I meet her?" "Of course." They walked across the lobby, past tables of David's colleagues and their families. The engineering team had grown significantly over the past year, and David recognized the faces of people he'd hired, problems he'd solved, projects that had started as abstract requirements and evolved into software that actually improved lives. "David!" Sarah's face lit up as they approached. She wore a simple black dress and the same expression of genuine warmth that had surprised him during his first weeks at the company. "And you must be Emma. I've heard so much about you." Emma stepped forward with the careful poise of someone who had learned early to navigate adult conversations. "Miss Chen, thank you for giving my dad a job. And for helping with my heart surgery. Dad says I wouldn't be here without you." Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced corporate smile giving way to something more authentic. She crouched down to Emma's eye level, a gesture that David recognized as characteristic. Sarah Chen paid attention to people, really paid attention, regardless of their age or position. "Emma, your dad is one of the most talented people I've ever worked with. We're lucky to have him. But more than that, he's a good man who loves you very much. That's not something you can hire for." Emma nodded seriously. "He's the best dad in the world. I can see that." As the evening progressed, David found himself moving through familiar rhythms, conversations with his team about upcoming projects, discussions with other department heads about resource allocation, the comfortable dynamics of a workplace that had become something more than just employment. But he was also watching Emma, seeing Meridian Tech through her eyes. She was fascinated by the engineering displays that lined the lobby walls, interactive demonstrations of the software his team had built, real-time dashboards showing the impact of their work across industries. When she discovered that one of their healthcare applications was used by Seattle Children's Hospital, she spent 20 minutes asking detailed questions about how the code worked. "She has your curiosity," Sarah said, appearing beside David as they watched Emma interrogate one of the senior developers about database architecture. "And her mother's confidence," David replied. "She's never met a question she was afraid to ask." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Emma gesture enthusiastically as she explained something about violin fingering techniques to the developer, who was listening with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was actually learning something. "David, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever think about that night, when Officer Rodriguez found you in the parking garage?" David considered the question. That night felt simultaneously like yesterday, and like a lifetime ago. The desperation, the exhaustion, the way hope had felt like something he couldn't afford but couldn't abandon. "Every day," he said honestly. "Not in a traumatic way, but it's hard to forget what rock bottom feels like. It keeps things in perspective." "I think about it too," Sarah said, "not just because of what happened afterward, but because of what I almost missed. I spent 3 days watching you on security cameras, making assumptions about who you were and what you wanted. I almost had you arrested before I bothered to learn your story." David looked at her, surprised by the admission. "It made me realize how many other David Martinez's I might have missed over the years. How many people with potential I dismissed because their circumstances didn't fit my expectations." Across the room, Emma was now demonstrating proper violin posture to a group of adults who were clearly charmed by her earnest instruction. David felt the familiar surge of pride that came with watching his daughter navigate the world with grace and intelligence. "We've made some changes because of that," Sarah continued. "Anonymous resume reviews, skills-based assessments before credential checks, partnership with organizations that serve people transitioning out of difficult circumstances. It's not enough, but it's a start." David nodded. "That's good, really good." "Your influence?" Sarah said, simply. "The reminder that talent doesn't always come with traditional packaging." The dinner portion of the evening was elegant but unpretentious, the kind of meal that acknowledged the importance of the occasion without overwhelming it with excess. David found himself seated between Emma and Jennifer, who had indeed been promoted to senior management and had become one of his most trusted collaborators. As the servers cleared the main course, Sarah stood to address the room. The conversation gradually quieted, attention focusing on the woman who had built Meridian Tech from an idea into a company that now employed over 400 people. "A year ago," Sarah began, "I thought I understood what success looked like. Revenue growth, market share, recognition from industry publications. All important metrics, certainly, but I've learned that they're not the only ones that matter." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room, landing briefly on David and Emma before continuing. "This year, our healthcare software helped reduce patient readmission rates by 15% across our partner hospitals. Our educational platform improved learning outcomes for over 500,000 students. Our environmental monitoring systems identified and prevented 3 potential ecological disasters." Applause rippled through the room, But Sarah raised her hand for quiet. Those numbers represent real lives, real families, real communities that are better off because of the work you do here every day. That's what success actually looks like, not just building great technology, but building technology that serves a purpose larger than profit. David felt Emma's hand slip into his under the table, and he squeezed it gently. But perhaps more importantly, Sarah continued, we've learned that taking care of each other isn't just good business, it's the foundation of everything else we hope to accomplish. When we support our people through challenges, when we create space for talent to emerge from unexpected places, when we remember that behind every line of code is a human being with hopes and fears and responsibilities that extend far beyond this office. She looked directly at David now, and he saw something in her expression that took him back to their conversation in the small conference room, when she'd offered him the director position and talked about remembering why she'd started the company. When we do that, we don't just build better software, we build a better world. The applause this time was sustained, genuine, the kind of response that came from people who felt seen and valued rather than just employed. As the evening wound down, David found himself on the building's observation deck with Emma and Sarah, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The city stretched before them like a circuit board, millions of lights representing millions of lives, each one a story of dreams and struggles and the quiet heroism of daily persistence. "Dad," Emma said, "can I ask Miss Chen something?" "Of course, sweetie." Emma turned to Sarah with the serious expression she wore when asking important questions. "Miss Chen, why did you decide to help my dad, even after you called the police on him?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same gravity Emma had brought to asking it. "Because I realized that I'd forgotten something important about myself," she said finally. "About what it means to take risks on people, to see potential instead of just problems. Your dad reminded me of who I used to be, before I learned to play it safe." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "And now you remember?" "Now I remember." "Good," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. "Because my dad says the best leaders are the ones who help other people become leaders too." Sarah smiled, glancing at David. "Your dad is very wise." "I know," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He's teaching me about coding too. I'm going to build an app that helps kids in the hospital feel less scared." David felt his heart contract with love and pride. Emma had been talking about this project for weeks, a simple game that would help pediatric patients understand their medical procedures through interactive storytelling. It was ambitious for an 8-year-old, but Emma approached challenges with the same methodical determination that had carried her through heart surgery. "That sounds like exactly the kind of project Meridian Tech should support," Sarah said. "Maybe we could set up an internship program for promising young developers." Emma's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really. Though you'll need to finish 3rd grade first." As they prepared to leave, Sarah pulled David aside for a private moment. "I want you to know that watching you this past year has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career," she said. "Not just because you've been an exceptional employee, but because you've reminded all of us what this work is really about." David thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the nights in his car, the envelope he'd clutched like a lifeline, the interview that had changed everything. "I never properly thanked you," he said, "for taking a chance on someone whose circumstances didn't fit the usual profile." "You thank me every day," Sarah replied. "By the work you do, the way you lead your team, the example you set for the rest of us, and by raising a daughter who's going to change the world." As David and Emma walked to their Kara reliable Honda Accord that had replaced the aging Civic, Emma was quiet, processing the evening's experiences with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "Dad?" she said, as they pulled out of the parking garage. "Yeah?" "I'm proud of you." David's throat tightened. "I'm proud of you too, kiddo." "And Dad?" "Yeah? I'm glad we never gave up." David reached over and squeezed her hand, thinking about the distance they'd traveled from that desperate night when giving up had seemed like the only reasonable option. About the people who had chosen to see potential instead of problems, hope instead of circumstances. about the future that stretched ahead of them now, bright with possibilities they were finally free to pursue. "Me too, Emma," he said as they drove home through the Seattle night, past the apartment that was truly theirs, toward the life they had built together from the pieces of dreams that had refused to break. "Me too." In the rearview mirror, the Meridian Tech building rose into the darkness, its lights reflecting off low clouds and casting a warm glow across the city, a beacon of the truth that sometimes, when you're brave enough to ask for help and wise enough to offer it, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things.